Ancient DNA has now rewritten what scientists thought they knew about woolly mammoth diet, and what it revealed connects directly to why these animals vanished from Earth. This video breaks down the study that changed the entire picture, what the DNA actually found inside mammoth remains, and what that tells us about one of the largest extinction events in prehistoric history. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if this kind of science interests you. Woolly mammoths were among the most successful large mammals the planet ever produced, roaming a stretch of the Earth that ran from Spain to Canada and from the Arctic islands down into what is now China. Standing up to 4 meters tall at the shoulder and weighing as much as 6 tons, they carried thick fur, curved tusks, and small ears shaped by evolution to reduce heat loss in Arctic cold. By any measurement, these were animals perfectly fitted to their environment, and for hundreds of thousands of years that fit held. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed mammoths were straightforward grazers, and the reasoning seemed solid. Those flat, ridged grinding teeth, similar in structure to modern elephants, pointed toward a diet of tough grasses and sedges. Frozen sediment layers across Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada, when examined for their pollen content, turned up grasses and trees dominating the record. The conclusion written from all of this was a cold, dry ecosystem called the Mammoth Steppe, and mammoths eating mostly grass. That consensus held for a long time, and almost nobody questioned the foundation it was built on. The foundation had a flaw built into it from the beginning, and that flaw had been distorting the picture without anyone fully recognizing how severe it was. Grasses and trees are wind-pollinated plants, which means they release enormous quantities of pollen into the air and sediment. Many flowering herbaceous plants are insect-pollinated, and they release very little pollen by comparison. When scientists extracted pollen from sediment cores and catalogued what was there, they were systematically undercounting an entire category of plants that may have been growing in abundance all along. Grasses did not appear dominant because they were everywhere. They appeared dominant because they generate far more pollen than everything else around them. Ancient DNA is what finally exposed that difference, and the difference turned out to matter enormously. If stories like this one interest you, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. February 2014 is when a paper published in the journal Nature forced a complete rethinking of what mammoths were eating and what the world they lived in actually looked like. Eske Willerslev of the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen led the work, alongside more than 30 co-authors drawn from institutions across Denmark, the United Kingdom, Canada, Norway, Sweden, the United States, and Russia. What separated this study from everything that came before it was not just the question being asked, but the method used to answer it. Instead of pollen, the researchers pulled ancient environmental DNA directly from permafrost sediment cores and from preserved gut contents and fossilized feces of megafauna, including woolly mammoths, analyzing 242 permafrost samples from sites spanning 50,000 years of Arctic history. Locations included northern Russia across Siberia, the Yukon and Northwest Territories in Canada, Alaska, Scandinavia, and Svalbard, and the scale of the effort was matched by the precision of the technique. As Willerslev put it when the results came back, nobody had the faintest idea that forms could be so dominant. It was completely unexpected. Environmental DNA bypasses the pollen problem in a direct way because it captures actual plant tissue that existed in the environment, not just the pollen that plants happen to release. A plant producing almost no pollen, but consumed in large quantities by a mammoth, would still leave DNA traces in the sediment and in the digestive contents of that animal. And for the first time, scientists were reading the biological record rather than a pollen-filtered version of it. What came back from that reading was not what the consensus had predicted. The record did not show a mammoth diet built around grasses and sedges. What it showed instead was something considerably more diverse and far more nutritionally rich. Central to the finding were forbs, herbaceous flowering plants that are neither grasses nor sedges, including buttercups, dandelion-type plants, wildflowers, and a range of other broad-leafed flowering plants. And the DNA evidence showed mammoths consuming these in substantial quantities. Specific plant DNA identified in mammoth gut contents and associated sediments included buttercups, dandelion-type plants, various wildflowers, and other forbs alongside the grasses and sedges the pollen record had always shown. And forbs are higher in protein and more nutritious than grasses. Joseph Crane, an ecologist at Kansas State University and a co-author on the study, described the revision this way: the current understanding of the mammoth steppe is a grass-dominated landscape like a giant cold savanna. What we're showing is that it was actually richer and more diverse. And that revision was not a minor adjustment to an otherwise stable picture, because the mammoth steppe was the most extensive biome on Earth during the Pleistocene epoch, running across the full northern latitudes of the planet. Changing what the dominant food source was across that entire ecosystem changes the understanding of how animals as large as mammoths sustained themselves in Arctic conditions, and access to protein-dense flowering plants rather than just tough cold weather grasses makes that question considerably easier to answer. The pollen bias had been hiding these plants for decades, invisibly, because forbs are mostly insect-pollinated and generate very little pollen relative to how abundant they actually were. DNA made them visible again, and in doing so, it also changed the foundational assumption about what mammoths depended on and what would happen when that dependency met a changing world. What mammoths were eating and why they disappeared are not separate questions, and the DNA evidence tightens the connection between them in ways that reshape the extinction story. The last ice age ended approximately 11,700 years ago, and as temperatures rose and moisture patterns shifted, vegetation across the northern hemisphere transformed. The forb-rich, open character of the mammoth steppe contracted in many regions and collapsed in others, replaced by tundra dominated by mosses and lichens in the far north, and by boreal forest and taiga dominated by spruce and larch further south. These replacement ecosystems were nutritionally poorer than what they replaced, and they did not support the plant communities mammoths had been depending on. In October 2021, Villerslev and a team including lead author Yucheng Wang published a second landmark paper in Nature, this time using ancient environmental DNA specifically to address the extinction question, and their conclusion was that rapid climate-driven vegetation changes were the primary driver. Villeslev's words from that study capture what the evidence showed. We have finally been able to prove that it was not just the climate changing that was the problem, but the speed of it that was the final nail in the coffin. That statement connects directly to the 2014 dietary finding. A population heavily dependent on forbs, living in a world where forbs were among the plants most disrupted by the transition from mammoth steppe to tundra and forest, carried a specific vulnerability that grass-dependent animals would not have faced to the same degree. The overkill hypothesis, first proposed by Paul Martin of the University of Arizona in 1966, remains part of the conversation because the timing of mammoth extinction in various regions does correlate with the arrival of human populations. And most researchers now favor a combination explanation where climate-driven habitat loss created the conditions of vulnerability and human hunting pressure added to the strain on populations already struggling to find enough of the right food. None of that interpretation holds its full weight without knowing what the right food actually was, and that is precisely what the 2014 study established. Mainland populations across Eurasia and North America largely disappeared between 11,000 and 10,000 years ago, but a small isolated group survived on Wrangel Island, a remote island in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of northeastern Russia, until approximately 4,000 years ago, placing their extinction in the same era as the Egyptian pyramids. The island gave them refuge from the changes that had destroyed the mainland populations, but it also placed a ceiling on how large the population could grow and how genetically diverse it could remain. A study published in the journal Cell in June 2024, led by Marianne de Haske of the Center for Paleogenetics in Stockholm, analyzed 21 woolly mammoth genomes from Wrangel Island and found that the population had stabilized at somewhere between 200 and 300 individuals, maintaining that size for roughly 6,000 years before the final extinction. Over that same span, the accumulating genetic consequences of isolation, including increasing inbreeding and a progressive loss of genetic diversity, were moving in one direction. The island sustained the mammoths physically for thousands of years after their mainland relatives were gone, and that's when the genomic deterioration they could not escape began to compound. What the dietary research tells us about the mainland extinction and what the Wrangel Island genomic research tells us about the final remnant population together describe an animal whose disappearance was the product of multiple pressures converging across thousands of years, none of which operated in isolation from the others. The research on mammoth diet and genetics is not purely historical, and the connection to active scientific work becomes clear when you consider what any serious attempt at de-extinction would require. Colossal Biosciences, founded in September 2021 by entrepreneur Ben Lamb and Harvard geneticist George Church, has stated its goal as using CRISPR gene editing to create a cold-adapted elephant hybrid carrying mammoth traits, including small ears, subcutaneous fat, and shaggy hair, having raised approximately $225 million in funding as of early 2024 and working toward producing a living calf by 2028. Though that timeline may have shifted since then, many scientists have raised serious questions about the practical and ethical challenges involved, including what the surrogate elephant mothers would face, and the enormous gap between editing individual genes and producing a viable living animal. Regardless of where one stands on de-extinction, detailed knowledge of what mammoths ate and whether that food exists in today's northern landscapes is foundational to any serious version of the effort. The same connection applies to Sergei Zimov's work at Pleistocene Park in northeastern Siberia, where large herbivores have been reintroduced since 1996 in an attempt to recreate the mammoth steppe ecosystem and demonstrate that megafauna maintained the grassland through grazing, which in turn could slow permafrost thaw and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The DNA evidence supports Zimov's core argument because it shows the mammoth steppe was maintained in part by the animals that grazed it, a feedback loop between animal and ecosystem that collapsed when the animals did. Whether restoring something like that loop is achievable at scale depends on understanding precisely what those animals were eating. And that question now has an answer it did not have before 2014. What the 2014 study established was not simply a detail about mammoth diet. It exposed that the most widely used tool for reconstructing ancient plant communities had a systematic bias baked into it, and that bias had been shaping the picture of the entire Pleistocene world for decades. Switching from pollen analysis to ancient environmental DNA revealed a mammoth steppe richer and more nutritionally complex than anyone had recognized, populated by flowering herbaceous plants that pollen records had been making nearly invisible. Mammoths were not the simple grazers their teeth had suggested, and the ecosystem that sustained them was not the cold, dry grassland the pollen record had described. That revision connects directly to the extinction. A diet built significantly around forbs meant a population carrying a specific vulnerability to the ecological transformations that ended the Pleistocene. and the speed of those transformations, as Villeslev noted, was the decisive factor. Mammoths had survived difficult conditions across hundreds of thousands of years, but the rate of change at the end of the Pleistocene outran their ability to follow the food they needed most. The science on woolly mammoths is still active, with new studies continuing to refine the picture, from DNA reaching back more than 1 million years to the detailed genomic analysis of the last island survivors on Wrangel. And what that science keeps revealing is that the story of the mammoth is more specific and more instructive than the image of a shaggy elephant on a frozen plain. These were animals fitted to a particular ecosystem, dependent on particular plants, and when that ecosystem shifted faster than they could track, they went with it. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. Please like it, share it with someone who would find it interesting, and subscribe to the channel so you see the next one.